It is brilliant to be with you guys this evening and to start this story week. And as has been said, we're going to explore together some stories from the 21st century of the change and the difference that Jesus has made in people's lives, but also some stories from 2,000 years ago. We're going to get to that in a second, of how Jesus encountered real people like you and me and changed their lives. Without further ado, though, I want to invite up Emyr McDonald, Professor Emyr McDonald, who's a professor in Cardiff University. Come and join me, Emyr. Let's give him a round of applause. And we wanted to, you'll notice this evening is called The Scientist, and we just wanted to hear some real life stories of how faith makes a difference in the real world. And Emyr is a professor in physics at Cardiff University, so I just wanted to ask him a few questions about how the scientist and faith in Jesus kind of find their way together in this one person. So, Emyr, tell us, first of all, a bit about your story. How did you come to be both a professor in physics and a Christian? How did that happen?
Well, I was just always interested in science in school, enjoyed maths, and I was actually a student here in Cardiff in the late 70s and did my PhD in Oxford, and I was in Bath Uni and back here in Cardiff. And really, as a Christian, I was brought up in a Christian family, but around when I was 14, it really kind of hit home with me that I needed forgiveness from God. And I became a Christian when I was about 15. And going through uni, and I did several research contracts, I just found it quite tough at times. It was quite an atheistic atmosphere, and there weren't many resources around to help you think through these issues. And so, but being a scientist, I wasn't happy unless I could really deal with questions. And so I really started in my late 20s, a period of reading a lot, mainly atheist stuff. And I found very quickly me coming to the conclusion, oh, actually, there are real answers to these questions, that, you know, and so I started then talking with people I worked with and whatever, and just actually found I was a lot more thought through than they were on many of these questions.
Brilliant. And picking up on that, Richard Dawkins, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, has famously said that intellectual and academic scientific thinking and sincere religious belief are completely incompatible. So as someone, once again, who's a physics professor and a Christian, what would your perspective be on this? Are they reconcilable, the scientific worldview and the Christian worldview? Absolutely.
I mean, I don't have any problem with that. I think actually there are deeper issues for an atheist and a scientist, and I'm very happy to enlarge on that. But take, for instance, you know, one of the books I read in that period was Blind Watchmaker. And he just felt that when it came to the real issues, he was really light on explanation, particularly, if we can say, for those of you scientists here, dealing with questions of evolution, that when it came to the questions of the incredible molecular mechanisms that are happening in each of us all the time now, copying the DNA, making proteins out of the information on the DNA, transcription, translation for those who are technical. The way those work are just incredible. You know, my research is in nanoscience relating to nanotechnology. And the way DNA is copied, you could get all the best scientists in the world together. You couldn't dream of making anything like that. It's just incredible the way it works, and the levels of error correction and stuff. And, you know, and the way he just passes over that kind of thing, which is so fundamental to what he's talking about. And I think the more we find out about life in that sense, the more difficult it is actually to think that it could all have come about from organic chemistry. It's an amazing claim, really.
Fantastic. And linked onto that then, I mean, maybe partly started to answer this next question, but what would be one or two pieces of scientific evidence that you have found most compelling when it comes to seeing how science and the Christian faith can be integrated?
Really, for me, it's because I kind of work in nanoscience with molecules. And molecules are tough things to try and control. They just don't behave as you want them to. A bit like children, really.
I was going to say a bit like students.
But then you look at how life works at the fundamental level, and the processes which had to be there from the very beginning of cellular life. And a mind just boggles. Just say one little thing, that every living cell, part of its energy system, electric motors. So every bacterium, every piece of grass you walk on, every living cell's got electric motors inside. Many of them, it's fundamental to the cell. And, as a physicist, you realize, hang on, the fact that you've got electric motors inside the cell, and they're very advanced, incredibly advanced technologically. So that's one piece of evidence. And you were asked about, Richard Dawkins, for instance, take the non-scientific, the more God delusion type book. And you read atheist reviews by people like Tom Nagel, who's a philosopher, atheist philosopher from New York State University. And I've never seen such a review of God delusion, far better than anything I've read from any Christians. It really takes them apart. And atheist biologists like Alan Orr have, that's dealing with really, I think Dawkins made a mistake by actually trying to step into more philosophical areas in that way. So in terms of scientific issues, I would say it's the way that any living cell works is just incredible.
And how about when it comes to the Bible? Because obviously one of the more questionable things that people who are skeptical towards the Christian faith often encounter is the validity of the Christian scriptures. And it would just be interesting from a kind of scientific mind's point of view, how compelling you found the evidence for the Bible's validity.
Sure. I mean, there are things in the Bible that I have found difficult to understand over time. But over time, what I found is actually that it makes real sense deep down, and more, I read it every day, and I just find it really explains life in a way that actually science doesn't. Science explains mechanics in that sense. But in terms of evidence, I mean, those of you who are historians, certainly I found it quite striking when I read about, one of the big historical tests for historicity of old documents is where they mention incidental details. That's taken, something that clearly wasn't in their intention to try and explain. And, you read Matthew's Gospel about the resurrection. It says about the Jews had spread a rumor that the soldiers had taken away the body. And it says, and the rumor's still going around amongst Jews today when he's writing. You don't make up stuff like that. At least there was a rumor about a resurrection and what happened. At the end of John's Gospel, Jesus meets his disciples by the seaside, and they fish and they have breakfast together. And there's a conversation between Jesus and Peter that John records. And Jesus says to Peter, you follow me. And Peter says very naturally, oh, but what about John here? And Jesus says, whatever I want for John, even if I want him to be around when I return, it's nothing to do with you. You follow me. And John clarifies the rumor that had come that Jesus had said that he's going to be around when Jesus came back to judge. And he's just clarifying that rumor and saying that was taken totally out of context. That's not what Jesus actually said. Now, again, you don't make up stories like that. Or for that matter, you don't make up stories where actually you turn up to be the cowards who all ran away when Jesus really had to face the music at his crucifixion. You know, anyone who makes up a story doesn't write themselves into the script in that way.
Thank you. And for those, finally, who are here tonight and who are exploring the Christian faith, maybe that's why they've come along this evening, but they are skeptical about the more fantastical claims of the Christian faith. What would you, as a physics professor, say to them tonight?
Well, if you're a scientist, I would strongly, I should say, read about how molecules work. But in terms of really where the rubber hits the road in everyday life, is to read these, 4 accounts of Jesus' life for yourself. I love reading them and get more and more out of them as time goes on. And, if you've got Christian friends, might be friends around the table, ask them about what happened in their lives, ask about their story, and try and match that with what you read in the Bible.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emyr. Can we give Emyr a round of applause? Thank you. Brilliant. Well, it really is a joy to be able to welcome you all this evening to this wonderful venue, by the way. Massive thank you to those who have set all this up. And it's great to be here. And I really just want to emphasize, however you come this evening, whatever your background, whatever your worldview, whatever your belief system, we are so happy to have you here. And we're so glad you've come along. And we've really set out these story evenings intentionally on these little picnic tables in order that we can discuss some of the big things about life together. I don't know about you and your university experience, but I always used to love it when the deep things of life came up in conversation. And very often, they came up accidentally. Anyone else have that experience? You're on Chippy Lane at 3 o'clock on a Saturday morning or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you start talking about the purpose and the meaning of life, and you're like, couldn't we do this in a kind of more sane environment? And that's really the purpose and intention behind these evenings, is let's intentionally think together about the big questions, and let's intentionally think together about how our stories may weave their way into the big questions of meaning, significance, purpose, suffering, hope, future, whatever it is we're going to look at across these evenings. And really we want to ground some of the things we're saying in stories, real life stories of Jesus Christ encountering people 2,000 years ago. Some of you will see on your tables, you've got these little John's Gospels. These are biographical eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus. And each of the evenings in this story week, we're just going to examine together the claims of this eyewitness, John, and others, I should say, about the life of Jesus. And so I'm going to start tonight. I just want to read one story. I'll find the page. Where is it now in this book? Here we go. Well, in fact, I'll find it on here. We'll find the page afterwards. But this is a story from John's Gospel, John chapter 20. And just listen to these words, and then I'm going to unpack some thoughts from it over the next few moments. It says in John chapter 20, verse 24, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called Twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the mark of nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe.'" It's up there on the screen behind me, actually, isn't it? 8 days later, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly, as before, Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand into the wound in my side. Don't be faithless any longer. Believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas exclaimed. Then Jesus told him, You believe because you have seen me. Blessed are those who believe me without seeing me. Now, true stories have the power to debunk myths, don't they? True stories have the power to debunk sometimes very popular myths. Think of the world of science for a second, and the popular myth that was believed for generations that the earth was flat. And all of a sudden, sometimes thousands of years ago, there were suspicions that this wasn't the case, and very often people got very badly persecuted for their belief that the world wasn't indeed flat. And in fact, hundreds of years ago, it was conclusively proved that that was not the case. A popular myth got immediately dispelled by a true story. Think about the millennium bug. Some of you are probably still in nappies when this happened, but I'm old enough to remember when 1999 turned into 2000, the world was in a state of meltdown because of the way certain computer systems have been programmed with the dates, and they thought, what is going to happen? Everything is going to crash. All the world economies are going to find themselves overnight bankrupt. It's going to be awful and dreadful. Planes are going to be dropping out of the sky. It's going to be disastrous. That was a popular myth that was spread amongst humanity, wasn't it? That was debunked by the true story when everyone woke up on January the 1st, 2000, and found it not to be the case. Maybe you yourself have given in to this well-meaning kind of exaggeration, a popular myth you've kind of proclaimed about yourself and your life that actually the true story would not testify to. And I want to argue tonight, and I want to pose the question tonight, could it be that in our skepticism of the Christian faith, we are actually believing popular myths rather than the true story? Could it be that in our skepticism, when we approach the claims of Jesus Christ, we're believing popular myths that the true story of Christianity and the Christian faith would debunk? It's like if I was to start a giant game of Chinese whispers tonight, and that would be a bit of fun, wouldn't it? And if I was to start down here with my little sentence and say, we're going to whisper it right up to the top to the guys on sound and visuals up there, let's see what comes out. And we know from playing Chinese whispers in our youth that what happens is the truth gets lost over time. Sometimes if you're a cheeky child like me, it gets purposefully twisted over time because you're like, this is a bit boring. Let's just throw in a rude word in there or whatever. Could it be that that's what's happened with the way that we have received and perceive the Christian faith? That actually our skepticism is based on the fact we are rejecting a caricature of Christianity and Jesus Christ rather than the real thing. And this brings me back to this story in the account of John in Jesus' life. I want us to return this evening to the founder of Christianity himself and his encounter with this man called Thomas, one of his followers, one of his friends. And I want us to see together how this story debunks 5 popular myths that skeptics come to when they're encountering Christianity. How this story debunks those 5 popular myths with the true story of Jesus Christ and his significance. So here's the first popular myth I believe this story debunks. Going to come up on the screen behind us. That the Christian story is for the in crowd. This story of Jesus' encounter with Thomas debunks the popular myth that the Christian story is just for the in crowd. See, many of you might come this evening and you might be saying, you guys in the Christian unions, you're only Christians because of where you were born, because of your background, because of your formative experience. You guys are in the in crowd. Actually, I'm on the outside. But can't you see the flawed logic in that argument when we're approaching any belief system or worldview? It could just as easily be said, you guys are atheistic or agnostic because of your background, because of where you were born, because of formative experiences. The issue is the truth, isn't it? The fundamental issue for whether we're in the in crowd or the out crowd when it comes to Christianity or any other worldview, the Christian story, is whether it's true. And you see, Thomas, this man 2,000 years ago, embodies, I think, how many of us approach Jesus. We feel like we're on the outside, cut off from a living experience of Jesus' significance. Just to give a bit of background to the words that we just read together, Jesus has gone to the cross, having claimed to be God's Son, the hope of all the world, and he has died the death of a criminal on this cross. And here we find his followers, his friends, huddled together after this traumatic experience where it feels like all their hopes have been dashed and lost. And there's an instance just before in John's gospel where they claim to have seen Jesus of Nazareth, this teacher, this master, this Lord who they have followed in his risen, resurrected form. But there's a problem with this meeting because this guy Thomas is not there. He was one of a close band of people, you may have heard of them, called the 12 disciples. One of them, Judas, had betrayed Jesus, and his life had ended in turmoil as a result of it. But the other 10 were all gathered in this room, except for this guy called Thomas. And so he comes to these disciples, his closest friends, and they tell him, mate, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is back. Now, put yourself in Thomas's shoes for a second. Even if you could entertain the impossibility on a cognitive level that this man who you have seen crucified is now back from the dead, on an emotional level, it simply makes you feel like an outsider, doesn't it? Put yourself in Thomas's shoes. Why would Jesus have shown up when I wasn't there? And maybe that's how you approach the Christian faith tonight. You feel like an outsider. You know, FOMO is a real deal for our generation, isn't it? The fear of missing out. We miss parties because of exams. We miss travel opportunities maybe because of illness. Maybe we even miss out on relationships because of our perceived sense of worthlessness. And sometimes it can feel like the Christian faith is just another thing that alienates us, that says you're not good enough. Your background, your belief system, your lifestyle keeps you on the outside. Yet Thomas's story can be mine and yours too. It says Thomas was not with them when Jesus came, but then it says 8 days later the doors were locked and Jesus came. See, the Jesus of the Bible, the Jesus of the New Testament, he comes to those who are on the outside. He doesn't count whether your story so far has been marred with rejection, whether your story so far has been caught up in all kinds of disappointment and delusions and depression, whatever it might be, whether you've got any historic connection to Christianity or not. Can I humbly present to you the question, could it be that you're believing a myth if you think the Christian faith is just for the so-called in crowd? The whole life of Jesus from beginning to end, in the biographical accounts we find of him in the New Testament, screamed his desire to welcome those who were far from God. Now this leads us to the second of the myths that I believe this story debunks. The Christian story is not just for the naive and uneducated. See, some of us, we feel like we're on the outside and Christianity's for the in crowd. Some of us, if we're really honest, we feel like the Christian story is for those who are naive, who need some kind of faith crutch, and who, let's be honest, are not reaching the high echelons of education that others in our world are. But notice this in this story once again. Where does Jesus meet Thomas? He meets Thomas in the midst of his skepticism and his questions. Thomas says, unless I see and touch the body of Jesus, his wounds, I will never believe. And yet it says that Jesus Christ in his resurrected form comes to this skeptic. He's already made his appearance to the other 10. He doesn't need to show himself to them again, but he comes specifically because Thomas is there. And here's the thing. If the Christian faith is true, and I can see that for many of us it's a big, big if tonight, but just come with me for a second. If it is true, and our lived experience is also real, then does it not affirm that God created us as reasonable and rational beings? Not just as those who are to be kind of existentially, spiritually switched on, but who are designed with logic and reason and rationale. It actually affirms pursuits like we've heard this evening of science and history and all the other academic pursuits for truth and logic and reason. But many in our world would want us to believe otherwise. Many in our world, as we've said already this evening, want to separate what actually belongs reconciled together. That famous claim of Richard Dawkins years ago now, that scientific intellectual reasoning and sincere religious belief are completely incompatible. And yet, even as we've heard from Emyr, professor in physics tonight, that it's becoming increasingly hard in the scientific realm to hold on to hard atheism, not to embrace the Christian faith. So if the Christian story is not just for the naive and uneducated, what evidence does it hold out for us? For those of us who are skeptics, and let me tell you, I have been there, wrestling with the questions of, is this true? What evidence does it hold out for us? Because we want to wrestle with the evidence that's there and not reject it on the basis of our own perceived evidence. Consider for a second the clues to God's existence in nature. You see, there are several options when it comes to the origins of all that is, isn't there? There's the option of luck. That all that is, the universe, the earth, the planets, the stars, all exists because these 15 constants with millions of possibilities within each of the constants, whether it be the gravitational constant or the amount of entropy in the universe, or whether it be to do with the nucleons and different things that I'm far above my pay grade, and I'm glad there's a physics professor here tonight. Whatever it is, these 15 constants that have to be bang on the money right, somehow added up together to form life as it is. I once heard it explained as if you had 15 roulette wheels in the sky. And you know, when you go in a casino and spin the roulette wheel, and there's a million markers on each of these 15 constants, and you see it tick, 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 tick on each one, and land exactly perfectly on what you need for life to exist. We live in a remarkable universe, don't we? But is that the explanation for life and existence? Or is the explanation not luck, but necessity, the multiverse theory, which is a unscientific and unproven response to how unlikely in the grand scheme of things that first option is? This idea that there are many universes, and so many that surely in some universe those 15 constants were going to add up just right. It's like that famous question that always gets asked, like in English literature in school, like what's it to do with monkeys and Shakespeare? Do you know the one I'm talking about? If you set monkeys writing for like a million years, eventually they write the works of Shakespeare. Is that what's going on in the existence of the universe? Or is there another option of design? May I humbly present to us this evening, it is not naive, and it is not on the basis of lack of education that you come to the conclusion that all that exists because there is a designer behind it. When we see anything that works, what do we assume? When we see this screen behind us and computers working and cars on roads and coffee machines, do we assume that somewhere, someplace, sometime, there was an explosion that gave birth randomly to this computer as chemicals piled together? No. When we see anything that works, our logical assumption as rational beings is to assume that there is design involved. And could that be the explanation behind our universe too? Beyond all that are the clues simply that matter gives birth to matter, doesn't it? Material things give birth to material things, and yet we know, all of us from experience, that the things that matter most to us in life, love, joy, meaning, hope, they're all completely immaterial. How do we explain that apart from an immaterial source? So there's clues in the existence of nature. There's clues to God's existence in the validity of the Christian scriptures. We've even heard tonight. I don't have time to go into all of this, but through textual criticism, we know that when we read these eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, we're not just reading fairy tales. Many of you, when we read that at the beginning, you might have just switched off thinking, this is just all make-believe. And yet, through textual criticism, we know that the New Testament stands unapproachably alone in ancient prose because of how quickly after the original copies were made and how many copies were made close to when the originals were written. The Christian story is not just for those who throw their brains out of the door in order to embrace Jesus. What about the evidence beyond that of the resurrection of Jesus? The historical proof that the tomb was empty, from the eyewitness accounts of those who'd been radically transformed so much that they lost their lives for the message that Jesus was alive, to the fact that the Romans and Jewish authorities never presented Jesus' body, even though it was in their interest to do so. So could it be that for those of us who come skeptically to the Christian faith, actually, there is another explanation to the faith that we've rejected? Actually, maybe we've been believing a myth. What if faith in Jesus Christ was not just an ethereal and subjective and existential spirituality, but was grounded in historical proof and invites us to reason with it on that basis? This leads us to the third of the myths that the story of Thomas encountering Jesus debunks. And that is that the Christian story is not a mere judgmental ideology. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm using some big words here. But you see, it would be very easy, wouldn't it, for us to stop saying faith in Jesus, the Christian story, is just about reason and rationale, and yet it doesn't stop there. It is not merely ideological. See, Christianity, if it is anything, is about a personal encounter with Jesus Christ. Let me use the example of something very straightforward and simple, the drinks that you drank when you came in this evening. And you could have taken a glass of water or a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and you could have reasoned with it on a merely ideological level. And probably if you did so, your friends might quickly desert you. If you got the water and said, H2O, and went on to list the chemical components and the way it's formed and just stood in awe of the water. Now, you'd impress some people, I give you that. But that's ultimately, we're not satisfied to leave things on the level of ideology, are we? We want to drink it and experience it. And one of the myths, once again, I think that many of us, and I've been there once again myself, in approaching the Christian story, is that this is just about ideas. Even the way I've been communicating thus far this evening could be somewhat unhelpful. Calling it the Christian faith depersonalizes a story that we are invited into. Not as bystanders and listeners, but as active participants. What if at the center of the Christian faith was what we find in Jesus encountering Thomas, was the living God, the designer, the creator of all things, reaching out to you, not in judgment, but saying, as Jesus did to Thomas, peace be with you, and extending to you an invitation to know him. What if the Christian story was more than just ideas, more than just some religious ideology? What if it was about a living encounter with Jesus Christ himself. What I love about this story with Thomas is it says in the text in John's gospel that the doors were locked. And yet Jesus breaks in. Many of us, we've locked our doors to God, haven't we? For many of us, whether it be the hurt that's been caused to us in our past, whether it be our own sense of worthlessness and hopelessness, whether it's what we've encountered of God in the Christians we've met or in other faiths or whatever it might be, we have locked our doors, and yet the Christian story tells the story of a God who loves you so dearly that he does not want to count your sins, your rebellion, your selfishness, your broken promises, your flaws against you, but wants to come in his Son, Jesus Christ, and speak peace to you. What if this was the Christian story, guys? Not a judgmental ideology designed to squeeze the joy out of you. What if the Christian story was the living God coming to you to maximize your joy in how you were designed to live in relationship with him? The fourth myth this story debunks for us. The Christian story is not just built on the teachings of Jesus. You see, this story of this encounter with Thomas, when Jesus says, "Peace be with you," he is not standing there as a ghost. It reminds us that Christianity, not only is it more than an ideology, but it is more than just the teachings of Jesus. For those of us who are skeptics, may I suggest that many of us come to the Christian story and the Christian faith, and actually the little bits that we've heard about what Jesus said, we quite like. Be good to one another, love each other, treat others as you yourself want to be treated, love your enemies. All these morals that very often Western civilization seeks to be built on. And yet, think on this for a second. Thomas could have got on with evangelizing the world, telling them about Jesus' great teaching, without this encounter with Jesus in his resurrected, risen form. And yet, he was not content to do so. He says, "Unless I see him, I will never believe." You see, the good news of the Christian story, once again, is not be nice to each other. Because the message, be nice to each other, doesn't help broken people, does it? It doesn't meet us in the depth of our need. What we need is not a recipe for life improvement, I believe. What we need is rescue. What we need is a new identity, a new meaning, a new hope. You know, when I encountered the Christian faith and the Christian story, I did so because I was desperately searching for meaning and significance in my life. And I was looking for it all over the place, in relationships and in sport and in music and in success. And as I drank from each of these kind of flagons, I was going to say, that was the only, as I drank from each of these cups of what the world was offering, I found time and time again that thirst did not go away. You see, what we need is more than just something that will enhance our life. We need true, real, lasting meaning and hope, don't we? And we can find those things in the teachings of Jesus, but ultimately, do you know what the Christian story is about? It's not about what we do. It's about what Jesus has done. Thomas needed transformative evidence that Jesus Christ was indeed alive. A guy called Tim Keller says, if you get rid of the resurrection, you disembowel Christianity. If you keep Christianity, as many of us want to do, as just the great teachings of Jesus Christ, this great prophet and moral teacher, you disembowel the very thing that Christ came to offer to the world. Christianity might be more palatable if we take out the fact that Jesus died to forgive us of our sins and rose again to prove that he was God and offer us the hope of eternal life. But Christianity is not more powerful if you take those things out. So where do we look if we want to discover what the Christian story is truly about? If we know we maybe have thought on these myths ourselves, can I encourage you tonight? Look into the evidence for the resurrection. If he rose from the dead, the implications are too powerful to ignore. If I was to tell you that there was buried treasure under high fields tonight that could cover all the rest of your student debt and set you off for a life of flourishing and prosperity, you could do two things, or two or three things with that claim. You could probably do what most of you would do, rightly so, and think that guy's an absolute loony and nutter for even considering such a thing. I'm just going to leave it be and go home, thank you very much. Or you could explore. You could dig. What if in the Christian story was the treasure we were all longing for? And what if the person who was proclaiming that to you tonight was not some kind of nutter with a nice jumper on and some funny stories about Pokemon in university, but was a man who had risen from the dead? Surely it's worth exploring that treasure for yourself. But not only is it the resurrection, you see, Jesus, when he sees Thomas, what does he show to Thomas? He shows him his wounds. Tim Keller once again says, only a wounded God can win us. It's the only thing that will blast through our fears and our guilt. This is why the story of Jesus dying on the cross is so central to Christianity. Because Christianity presents to us a God who was willing to bleed for us, to forgive us, to welcome us home, to reconcile us to himself. We ultimately don't need a teacher, do we? We've got plenty of teachers. We need a savior. And that leads me on to the final myth that I believe this story debunks for us tonight, and that is that the Christian story is not therefore about receiving Jesus as a spiritual guru. The Christian story is about receiving Jesus as Lord. See, let's just recap. If Thomas's encounter shows us that Jesus is for us, that he welcomes us, that we're not outsiders, that he wants to bring us onto the inside, and if the Christian story reminds us that Jesus invites skeptics and those who want to use rationale and reason, and those who want to use their intellectual powers to deduce whether there is truly evidence, and Jesus welcomes those people. And if the Christian story is not merely judgmental ideology, but the living God reaching out to us with his offer of forgiveness and hope and peace, and if the Christian story is built on the historical truth of the death and resurrection of Jesus, then what is our response to all this? Like I said, at the very least, could we not explore more? And beyond that, notice what Thomas did in the story. He fell to his knees when he saw Jesus before him, and he said, "My Lord and my God." That was both a propositional statement. What he was saying was, you are who you say you are, God himself. But it was also a profoundly personal statement. My Lord and my God. See, the Gospels would tell us, until you see Jesus as the center of your life, you have not reached the climax of the Christian story. See, Thomas is a really interesting guy because in church tradition, and maybe some of you have heard of this, but he's known as Doubting Thomas, Thomas the Doubter. He quite often gets quite a hard time for being a skeptic. And yet, in the way that this eyewitness account is written, Thomas is the climax of the entire book. And he is the only person in the entire book who truly gets it, that Jesus is Lord and God. He is our example. With all his doubts, with all his skepticism, Jesus honors him, and John honors him as one who got it, as our example in many ways. And notice this as well, and I'll finish with this, that Thomas never actually touched the wounds of Jesus. You might have remembered from what we read at the beginning. He says, unless I touch his wounds, I will never believe. Some of us, we come with our skepticism this evening, and we rightly want proof and evidence, but there is some times where those things become in themselves a God. We will not believe until X, Y, or Z happens. And I just want to encourage us, maybe for some of us this evening, we have seen enough of Jesus. You know, when I got married to my wife, Charlotte, I certainly didn't know everything about Charlotte, and she certainly didn't know everything about me. And she may not have made that decision if she had known. But here's the thing. The commitment to get married to Charlotte was not a blind leap of faith. It was not naive. It was not uneducated. I committed on the basis of what I knew, and ever since, I've been discovering more of what I knew then, that she's an amazing person. And so it is with the invitation of the Christian faith to each one of us tonight. We'll never know all the answers, but Jesus invites us to explore, to discover, to examine, but to commit as well on what we know and have seen of him to be true, that he is a God who has beaten death, risen from the dead, who loves us. And the journey of the Christian faith is discovering more ongoingly of how amazing that Jesus is. It's been brilliant to get to share with you guys this evening. Before I do shut up, just want to flag up a few ways of responding to this evening. First of all, do take away these copies of John's Gospel. They're completely free for you, our gift to you. Maybe you want to consider reading through this with a friend, someone maybe who's brought you this evening. But also, we'd love for you to fill in these little sign-up cards. And maybe if you could find those on your table now, you could do that right now, because what we're going to do in a second, we're going to have some teas and coffees, a little break, and then we're going to have an opportunity for some questions and answers. And if anything I've said or even Emyr said earlier in the interview struck a chord and you'd like to explore more about that, then please do fill these in. Is it these ones that the questions are going on? Yep. And people will be around to collect them in, and we'll have a time of Q&A in a second. But please do give us any comments about this evening, anything at all that you feel like you want to take away. There's also 2 boxes on there. One says, I want to know more, which is pretty self-explanatory, and there'll be more opportunities this week to discover that. And another one says, count me in. And we don't want to assume tonight that maybe some of you have heard for the first time or the millionth time of who Jesus is, and you're actually saying, no, I really do want to think about committing to Jesus. Please do tick that box, and we can be in touch with you about that as well. But thank you so much for listening. Enjoy some tea and coffee, and we'll be back in a sec for Q&A.
Cool, so now we're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions of these guys here. And first one that we've got from the tables is, can we still enjoy secular culture and adhere to Christian values?
Yes, would be the short answer to the question. So the question, can we still enjoy secular culture while adhering to Christian values? I would say that if the Christian story is what we've unpacked this evening, that we, through Jesus Christ, can be reconciled to God, forgiven of the stuff we've done wrong, and welcomed back into loving relationship with the God who created us and who we were designed for, then I would say that has the potential not only to affirm, on the one hand, many of the things we enjoy about culture, because God created all those things, but it has the potential as well to enrich those enjoyments, because we now know who gave them, why he gave them, and the way in which they're designed to be enjoyed. So I would certainly say that for me personally, I believe that my Christian faith enriches my enjoyment of all things culture, whether it be music or sport or food or language or relationships, whatever it might be. I would also say that, as with any relationship, your relationship to that person does change both the way you enjoy things you already enjoyed, and it also often changes your enjoyments full stop. So I use a stupid example with this just to illustrate. But I always used to hate, like full-on despise, like fairground rides and roller coasters and stuff like that. And my wife Charlotte is a total adrenaline junkie. She's currently 8 months pregnant, so those two things don't kind of go together right now. But when I got married to Charlotte, this thing that I'd never enjoyed, all of a sudden, through relationship with her and loving her, I began to love the things that she loved. And I'd say relationship with God is the same. There are some things that the Bible says are not good for us as human beings, and are destructive for our relationships with one another and destructive for our relationship with God. And there is a sense in which the Christian faith can bring very genuine transformation to our enjoyments, both in a positive sense and in also helping us to enjoy things right because we're enjoying them as the Creator designed. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Owen.
But please come and speak if I've completely missed the point there.
And the next question is, what I know about God is that he sent his son to die a painful way. If he does that to his son, what would he do to me?
Wow. So, if God treats Jesus like that, what will he do to me? I think it's really important at this stage not to bring too much separation between God and Jesus, actually, in the way we ask and answer that question. Because the Bible, and this is, is clothed in mystery and kind of delving into some deep theology in many ways in answering this question. But the Bible presents Jesus as God's Son, but as one with God, of one mind and one heart with God. And so Jesus, in choosing the destiny of death in the place of people who stand guilty before God because of our rebellion against him, Jesus, in choosing that, was part of the very same decision as God the Father, God the Spirit. There was no separation in God in that sense, which I think brings a remarkable sense of wonder to the Christian gospel, that God would choose to suffer in our place in order to forgive us, in order to reconcile us to himself, in order that we might see how much we mean to him. And I think, actually, the answer to that question is Jesus suffered so that we don't have to. And Jesus, in the Christian worldview, according to the Christian story, suffered the punishment that we rightly deserved so that God would not have to treat us that way. And I think, once again, that's why we believe the Christian story is worth telling, because it's a story of freedom, of hope, of forgiveness, of joy, of rescue, of reconciliation, and of an assurance that because God sent Jesus to die for us, we can know he will never treat us who receive Jesus with anything but unconditional love and acceptance.
We've got another question. If God is everywhere and God is good, how is there evil?
Wow.
Shall I
Do you want to jump in, Emmy?
Yeah,
Go
sure.
for it.
I remember Boxing Day 2004 when the tsunami hit in Indonesia. I also remember Aberfan, who we're remembering 50 years ago. I was a young child then. Two examples. One, which there was huge human responsibility that was never faced up to by the coal board in Aberfan. Another, in terms of tsunami, that there was no human responsibility. And I was left asking, God, what are you doing here? I mean, I can give the scientific answers that if it wasn't for tectonic activity, we'd all be dead because life wouldn't be possible. But you're just left thinking, What is happening? It's a big question we all think about, and as a Christian, I think about a lot. May I just say that there's a third kind of suffering, apart from the ones that there is human responsibility and that there isn't. And that's suffering caused by greed, self-centeredness, pride. And you can ask the question, actually, which of those three causes most suffering in this world? And I think we would all agree, well, certainly when I've talked to people, generally agree that actually the third causes a huge amount of suffering, more than the others. And it raises the question, suffering's a big question, it's not an easy one, but if we hold it against God so much, why do we cause it to each other? Yeah, maybe in our families, with friends, relationships. And actually, it says something about human nature, doesn't it? That we do actually do those things. At the end of the day, I can't give you an answer to the question of suffering. It's a complex one. But I think Owen hinted at, the fact that Jesus himself came to this world with the intention of suffering in our place. It's deep, isn't it? And we can talk. I'm very happy to talk personally, but I don't want to give any glib answers. It is a serious question, and I think it does get to the heart of human nature and actually what God wants to do about it.
Thank you for handling that so delicately. Next question asks, is it okay to pick and choose with Christianity? For example, can I believe some stuff, but not others?
Very good question. So I'd say when it comes to picking and choosing with Christianity, I guess that's part of what I was trying to get at with that fourth popular myth, that many of us want to embrace the teachings of Jesus, but on the basis that he is just a moral teacher or a kind of religious zealot. And I would say many people have famously said, whether it be Bono, U2, or C.S. Lewis, famous Oxford, Cambridge academic, that Jesus himself doesn't leave us with that option, unfortunately. Jesus doesn't come claiming to be a great prophetic voice or a great religious moral teacher. He comes claiming to be God himself. And I certainly think our doorway into the Christian faith is a multitude of things, in terms of the different aspects of it and the different parts of the Christian story that warm us initially. Maybe some of us sitting here tonight thinking, yeah, I can kind of compute with the idea of the resurrection, but I hate the idea that God suffers. Like, what kind of a God is that? And some of us might be sitting here thinking, I love the idea of a suffering God, but it gets wacky when you say this guy rises from the dead. And I would just encourage you, if there's a part of the Christian story that you're warming to, then explore more, discover more. Certainly, don't cut yourself off. Once again, don't make the mistake of feeling like an outsider when Jesus may himself be welcoming you in. All that being said, I think when it comes to embracing the Christian faith, Thomas's response reminds us, doesn't it? It is all or nothing. It's my Lord and my God. It is you are the center of the universe, of life itself. And so I think Christ himself doesn't leave us the option of taking him for his teachings or whatever it might be, whatever was behind that question, I don't know. But leaving the idea that he is God. To be a Christian is to plant your feet firmly on the truth the reasonable truth that Jesus Christ is who he says he was and died for us and rose again. So, yeah.
Thank you. So that's all the time we've got tonight for questions. But if you don't feel like your question's been answered, I think these guys are going to stick around. So